Hi, everyone. So Sunny introduced James at Chi, as many of you might remember, but unfortunately fell sick today and isn't able to make it. So I'm introducing James in her place. And in this intro, I've borrowed just some of her points so you can hear a little bit from the both of us. So it's my pleasure to introduce James Landay, one of this year's recipients of the SIGCHI Lifetime Research Award. I want to start with a message that actually is from James himself. So it was to announce the award to his students, as I feel like it really captures his philosophy as an advisor. So here it is. We won an award. Yes, today I found out that we won the Chi Lifetime Research Award. It is my name, but that's just how these things work. We won it. All of the research I've done as a faculty member has been led by my truly brilliant, hardworking, and kind students and postdocs. We won this together. No way do I get named to this prestigious award without you. My entire career model has been based on helping my students achieve success, and then success would follow for me. I long ago concluded that my purpose to be a professor was not to do research, but to help produce good people, help students with a lot of potential become more than they might otherwise become on their own. Research is purely the vehicle we use to get there. So winning this thing is pure icing on the cake. Sorry, I'm shaking a little bit. As far as I'm concerned, I wasn't expecting it. I didn't even know someone had nominated me. But of course, his contributions to research and the HCI community go without saying. So starting with his PhD work in the space of creativity and prototyping, James introduced this area of interactive design tools with prototypes like Silk, the first to demonstrate the use of sketching in user interface design tools. And his work in this area has paved the way for products like Balsamiq, Figma, and Canva, as most of you have probably heard of. He has since made contributions in numerous research areas that not only impact us as a research community, but also make important broader societal impact, focusing on areas ranging from education through Smart Primer, or mental and physical health through UbiFit and Huizuki, and environmental sustainability through UB Green and his more recent initiatives around designing hybrid physical digital spaces. And through this work, he's introduced questions around behavior change, privacy, and generally the role that AI can play in helping users better perform tasks and activities. And in addition to his own research, James has been a leader in the community as an institutional program builder. He established the first HCI group at UC Berkeley, helped found the UW group at UW, spent a few years as the lab director at Intel Labs Seattle, where Sunny also worked, and most recently helped found the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, where we are now. And I want to circle back to students. So in particular, I want to highlight the ways in which James empowers and centers his students, not only in research, but also in his teaching and through diversity initiatives, both of which I've had the fortune to work on with him. James goes above and beyond as a teacher, both in helping to train the TAs who help teach and to create opportunities for the students. So I got to TA for him both at Stanford and at SCPKU in China. So this is James actually spending time with the TAs late at night grading. He also spent a lot of one-on-one time with each TA working on assignments or other class material. And then in China, in addition to the class, he and Ge also took students to various cultural sites in China, as well as to visit companies and labs, both in China and in the Bay Area, to see HCI in practice. On diversity, James instills a value of community and service into each of his students. As one of just many, many examples, James was core to the initiative at Stanford to bring current grad students to Grace Hopper to talk to interested students about the application process and to waive their application fees to avoid students actually filtering themselves out before applying. So I've personally heard from several students throughout the years that conversations at Grace Hopper convinced them to actually pursue a graduate degree. And going back to Sunny's words, she says, James has a selfless commitment to mentoring and lifting others up. She also shared this message from one of his former advisees, Tara Matthews. James Landay is a kind of advisor and mentor who always puts his students first and is an incredible teacher and advocate for us. I credit James Landay for helping me to become an HCI researcher. He advised me as an undergraduate when I knew nothing of HCI and was a strong supporter when I later sought to go to grad school. James fostered a culture in his lab where I always felt welcome and where other students always looked out for me and each other. Thank you, James, for being an important mentor to me and so many students over the years. I think it goes without saying that my own experience is very much the same. James is a mentor who cares about us, not just as researchers, but also as people, helping us grow in more ways than I can really describe in words, and to help us learn to recognize our own value. James absolutely means it when he says that he's a lifetime friend and mentor. He's even had dinner with my parents and my sister in China without me. And James genuinely just embodies everything I hope to be as a mentor. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very big welcome to James Landay, recipient of SIGCHI Lifetime Research Award.
Okay, thank you for that kind introduction, Jane. And Jane really deserves a lot of thanks because she literally got told yesterday, hey, any chance you could fill in, because Sunny, who had also done a really kind introduction in Hawaii for this talk, fell ill with some food poisoning. So thanks you, Jane, for that really touching introduction and for filling in, doing it at the last second. Just to give you context, I gave a version of this talk in Hawaii exactly a month ago, I just noticed on the slides. And it was supposed to be recorded, and due to a technical glitch, it wasn't recorded. And I said, any chance we could do it again and record it? Because there were a lot of people who said, I can't make it. And of course you recorded it, send me the link. And I said, I don't have it. So that's why we're doing it again. So thank you also for coming in person. And thanks to the many people who are watching the live stream, and thanks to the people who maybe have insomnia in the future and are watching this late at night looking for a way to fall asleep. So here we go. So I want to thank the selection committee and my colleagues who nominated me for this great honor. It's a great honor as well for me to be selected along with the three stellar researchers whose work I've always respected and admired: Susan Bodker, Jody Forlisi, and Wendy Mackay. I also thank the many colleagues who have written me letters throughout my career as I moved institutions, allowing me to take this academic journey that I'm going to talk about. But I want to especially thank my students and postdocs over the years. I will mention some during this talk, but they have done far too much great work over the last 27 years to show all of their work and mention each by name. I'd be up here for at least 4 hours if I were to do that. As Jane mentioned, I said, we have won this award. There's no way I would have had any of the success I've had without them. And it's been an amazing journey, an exciting journey. And I'm going to give an overview of some of the key research projects we've carried out at each of the places that I've been on this academic journey. But more importantly, I'm going to highlight some of the key principles I've learned and used to help the organizations I've led or been part of to succeed. So one of my key stops on my academic journey was living and working in China for 2.5 years in 2009 to 2011, pretty much halfway through my current career. It's not over yet. This was a really important experience for me culturally and for my family culturally, but also for my research, my career, and my world outlook. And it was quite exciting to see a part of history in terms of the economy and influence in China that was happening at this time. But China has a really long history, over 5,000 years. And I was really amazed at how that history and historical sayings and stories shape how people think. So here's one example. Many of you have seen this slide in the past, but I haven't actually shown this slide until this talk in many years. This is the bronze galloping horse, which is one of the most famous cultural relics in China from the Han Dynasty. It's about 2,000 years old, and it was uncovered in 1969 in the west of China. And it shows a powerful horse that is so fast that it is literally flying. It treads on a small swallow that you see at the bottom here that looks up in horror. And this replica doesn't quite capture the liveliness and beauty of the original, which is about, well, actually I have one. So the replica is about this size. The real one's about 3 times that size. If you ever get a chance to go to the Gansu Provincial Museum to see it. But what was interesting is when they uncovered this in 1969, it baffled the experts who studied it for several years. Given the technology of the day of when it was cast, they couldn't figure out how it was sculpted to maintain its balance, since it's simply bounced on that bird. And I thought that this represented an interesting metaphor, because the sculpture itself represents balance. So balance between the artistry and the technology to calculate that center of mass somehow, the art of the powerful, lively horse, and this technology to calculate that center of mass in a way so it wouldn't topple over. And finding this successful balance is kind of a key theme in much of my career, trying to find a balance between design approach to technology as well as a more computer science algorithmic technical approach. Finding a balance between academia and industry and the different needs of those two. And so I'm going to take you through my career and discuss how finding that right balance leads to these powerful principles that I want to describe. So at the end of my undergraduate degree in EECS at UC Berkeley, I was looking for a graduate program. I wanted a program that combined this technical focus of computer science that I had studied as an undergraduate, but also a focus on creating new user interfaces to computing. So I was really compelled by how could we make computing both easier, but also to envision what the future could be like. And Carnegie Mellon really offered that balance to me. I was lucky to get to work with Brad Myers as my PhD advisor, who's the current director or chair of the Human Computer Interaction Institute there, which didn't exist when I was a student. And he was working on exactly the type of things I was interested in. So this was a great place for me to go. And my first years as a young researcher were about this balancing design and technology. So I saw that designers were sketching their interface designs on paper, and they were really avoiding a lot of the advantages of that time of electronic tools. And they were doing this because of both the fluidity of sketching on paper, so it was really fast and fluid, but also the ambiguity of a rough sketch. So the holes in the sketch in some way led to more lateral thinking and more creativity. And we had seen studies of this in other fields of design. And so sketching really led to that creativity and also making sure that folks who saw your design were focused on the high-level concepts instead of the low-level visual details. So as Jane mentioned, in response, I created Silk, which stood for Sketching Interfaces Like Crazy with a K. And it was a pen-based tool that balanced these concerns and offered the advantages of both sketching and electronic representations. So it would recognize a designer's user interface sketch, but purposely leave it in this informal representation while adding interactivity to that representation. And that was the first of many projects that I did over the years that really used AI as an enabling mechanism for a new user interface paradigm. Though we've had to wait almost 30 years for the AI to really work in more general situations like we're seeing today. Now, Silk represented what I termed an informal user interface. So it tried to balance this fluidity of, in this case, paper and interactivity of computing. And I continue to support designers in their exploration of applications for new technologies so they could try them out and find out what works. And we did this in several other things for location-aware interfaces, for activity-aware interfaces, and a variety of others over the years. But some of the important things I learned at CMU were not technical, but were more organizational, or how to make organizations work best. The most important principle I learned at Carnegie Mellon was what they call the reasonable person principle. And this guided everything that happened really in the School of Computer Science. It's like the golden rule: treat others the way you'd like to be treated. It was a way to balance competing interests and achieve the right outcomes. So for example, rules were meant for the common case, to make decisions without having to involve everybody in the decision. But when the situation warrants it, the reasonable person principle says, let's do what is right for the people involved. So for example, when I was in graduate school, I had failed some courses repeatedly. And in fact, I had a letter that said, if you don't pass this class by the end of this term, you will be terminated from the PhD program. And at the beginning of that semester, I tried, but I guess I didn't try hard enough. I took the midterm in this theoretical programming language course, and I got a pretty poor grade. And at that point, I was pretty much starting to interview for jobs because I decided, okay, I'm going to leave graduate school and go get a job. And this was probably 1993 or so. It may have been financially much better for the rest of my life had I left, but whatever. I was lucky that one of my senior colleagues, David Cosby, really gave me this very motivational speech. I like to say it was the win one for the Gipper speech, where he pretty much said, look, you've got 10 weeks left. You know, you need to study as hard as you can and work as hard as you can. You should only be studying, working out, and eating. That's all you should do for the next 10 weeks. You could do this. And I worked really hard, and I went to the office hours of the professor for this course many times, trying to understand his course notes, which were quite hard to understand. And I took the final exam, and unfortunately I did well, but not well enough to have gotten the grade I needed to pass the course. And I can't even remember if that was a B- or what was the optimal grade. And I went and talked to him, and he said, I'll think about it. Come back and, you know, on this other day, and I'll tell you my decision. So after a few days of waiting, I went back, and he told me, prove to me that I was right. And so he ended up passing me. And I know he didn't do this arbitrarily. There was another student in my class who was in the same situation, and he did get kicked out of the program, which was unfortunate. And I know that I'm also fortunate that students maybe from a different minoritized background may have not gotten the break that I got, but I did get that break. And in some ways, I felt that was an instance of bending the rules to do what was right. I had been doing well in research, and that was the end goal of this program, but also fluidly taking advantage of opportunity. So not to be hampered by someone saying, this is the way things must be done. And CMU School of Computer Science, at least at that time, I can't vouch for it today, was a really fluid environment. And they had a lot of agility that allowed them to move rapidly into emergent research areas. For example, human-computer interaction, which they were studying there years before there was anyone really at Stanford, Berkeley, or MIT that were tenured in this area. And I think this reasonable person principle really is a key reason for that fluidity. So it's always served me well in the leadership positions I've held. I used it in recruiting grad students to Berkeley when I was junior faculty there who didn't have the usual profile. I felt a more balanced skill set would be the best for exploring a field like HCI. So I would look for students who I thought had some skills that would be really important. And I would look to make exceptions, for example, if their background was different. For example, one student had a bachelor's degree in philosophy, which was not typical to admit in a top computer science department, or somebody who had a GPA that was much lower than what was normal. And so these exceptions have ended up some of my greatest students who are strongest students who've done well. Scott Clemmer, who went on to a faculty position at Stanford and UCSD. He had a background from Brown Computer Science, but also from the Rhode Island School of Design and Art Semiotics. This was not a normal background, and his grades weren't all that strong. But really, I felt that skill and balance between those two would be really important to doing great work, and he's gone on to do that. Or Mark Newman, who's now a professor in the Information School at Michigan. He was a professional punk musician, a professional barista, and he had a philosophy degree, but then he found computer science as something he could do, and he took courses on the side and then applied to grad school. Again, his profile is not what we would normally admit, and I saw something there and was glad that he came and has gone on and done great work. And so I got these students admitted and working on this informal computing research division, and then along with other strong students such as Jason Hong, Jimmy Lin, Anup Sinha, who are all still active in the HCI community today. We worked on this agenda. Mark and Scott both worked on the Designer's Outpost shown here, along with Kate Everett, who did a master's degree and eventually her PhD at the University of Washington. She's now at Microsoft. And this was a tangible computing system that tried to balance the physical and virtual. So designers could create an information architecture for a website using physical Post-it notes on this wall, but they could be linked together using virtual ink and a virtual pen. And so this physical nature supported this fluidity of design, while the underlying vision recognition, again, we're using AI as a user, allowed real fluid movement between these notes and reorganization of the notes and links. We built it. We tested it with designers and they wanted it. So this was a research prototype, but we had people saying, okay, how do we buy this? How do we get this into our office? And I think having students with this diverse set of skills, coming from these diverse backgrounds, design, philosophy, art, as well as computer science, helped us create things that people wanted. And so I've always believed in the Berkeley motto, at least the motto that was there when I was an undergrad. I don't know what they say today, but they had it plastered all over the university, excellence through diversity. And I've experienced its positive effects firsthand. So besides students with diverse skills and backgrounds, we also needed faculty across diverse fields. So at Berkeley, I created the Group for User Interface Research, or GEAR, which was a cross-campus group of a diverse set of faculty and students. Most such centers at that point live mainly in one department. So there'd be some research group in the CS department or something like that. I was really trying to do it across the campus. At that point, interactive computing research became popular at Berkeley. We hired other faculty, and I really like to be among this group of smart, creative people. That's always what's got me excited in my work. And this diversity helps us also create innovative new ideas, because people from different backgrounds have stories to bring that can inform our work. And I've always believed in the power of that. After receiving tenure at Berkeley in 2002, a great opportunity arose to strongly leverage that diversity, and I took it. So Intel offered me the chance to lead an interdisciplinary industrial research lab. So we had a balance of disciplines, from low-level people doing hardware, low-level machine learning, to high-level human-computer interaction people like Sonny Consalvo, who worked for me there at Intel. And I grew that diverse team and had them work in two key areas. So one was location-enhanced computing. This was the point where we were just starting to be able to have the ability to have location on our phones and have applications that could take advantage of it, or on our laptops. And the other one was activity inference. Again, we were at the very early stages of being able to use sensors to infer physical activities that people are doing in the real world and use that in applications. And we motivated those projects from an application perspective so that we could show value. So a crucial problem facing society is the rising cost of healthcare. This was true already in 2003. It's still true today, in fact, more so. And at Intel, we felt technical solutions like activity inference offered a great opportunity for us to have impact on this. We focused our research on an elder care scenario and a personal fitness scenario, and Sonny was a key leader in both of these projects. In the elder care scenario, the idea was to allow an elder or an older adult who's in the early stages of decline to stay in their own home longer than they could today. And by monitoring their activities of daily living, for example, are they eating? Are they taking their medication? Are they exercising or getting social contact? We could inform a remote caregiver, who we saw in our research was often a daughter, on how mom was doing typically. This ended up improving the relationship. So adult children stopped treating the elder like a child. For example, calling them 5 times a day, saying, "Mom, did you take your pills? Mom, did you get outside?" etc. And then again, focused on the kind of relationship they had previously. For example, "Mom, guess what Johnny did in school today?" So again, the families that we tested it with wanted it, right? And this topic, I think, is not been solved yet. And it's so important that we're working on this again today, 20 years later, here at Stanford, in a large project that I'm carrying out with Sarah Billington in civil engineering and Fei-Fei Li here in computer science. So this work required a diverse team to develop and evaluate these applications from a user perspective. So as well as to invent several important breakthrough enabling technologies. So we developed the iBracelet, which was an RFID reader in the form factor of a bracelet, with folks like Matai Philippos and Ken Fishkin and a stable of strong engineers. And so the idea is RFID tags would eventually be on objects in people's homes, either because they'd be built in by manufacturers or that the tag price would come down so far that it would be inexpensive to attach them. We haven't seen them built in so much. You have devices that have this technology, but the price definitely has come down that you could attach them. And so the idea was, every time the elder's hand was touching one of these objects, we would get a read of that object. And then with machine learning, we'd be able to tell what activity they were doing. So maybe they might be making tea because we've seen them touch the tea kettle and water in the tea bags, or they're touching a toothbrush and some toothpaste and they're in the bathroom. That together, we could infer they were brushing their teeth. I recruited Josh Smith, who's now faculty at UW, to join Intel. And Josh had a really eclectic background. So he had an undergraduate degree in physics, and then he did his PhD at the MIT Media Lab and did a lot of interesting hardware stuff. And I saw this incredible diversity of skills. In fact, I'd say our whole research team saw the incredible diversity of skills that he brought when he interviewed, and we hired him right away. And in his first week, he came up with this thing called the WISP, the wireless sensing, computation, and communication with no batteries. So he figured out a way to take a traditional RFID tag and just by simply putting a mercury switch and two antennas, or actually two tags and a mercury switch connected to the antennas, we could have an object that as a person manipulated it, the mercury switch would move around and you would see two different IDs being read. And so you would know, oh, this thing's moving, versus if it's just sitting there, you'll see one. So he did that and later made a lot of other RFID tags that could simply just use the energy that's out there from TV stations as well as Wi-Fi to power these devices. But all of this work would allow us to build this elder care app without that elder having to wear a bracelet, which is one of the flaws as somebody's starting to decline mentally, whether they're going to be able to remember to wear it, remember to charge it, et cetera. So the idea of being able to do it without a wearable was interesting to us. We also looked at sensing physical activities that don't involve tools or objects. For example, sensing how a person is exercising. So whether they're walking, running, biking, taking the stairs, or on an elliptical trainer. So Tanzim Chowdhury, who's now faculty at Cornell Tech, helped develop the Intel mobile sensing platform, along with the late, great Professor Gaetano Borriello, who recruited me to follow him leading Intel Lab Seattle, who helped lead this project. This MSP contained processing, communication, and 10 sensors. So for example, 3-axis accelerometer, light, barometric pressure, sound, essentially any sensor we could throw on that board that was cheap, we threw on there. And every second that MSP was inferring what the user was doing. So it might saying, James is walking, 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 running, running, walking, walking, walking. And then that would be sent to the phone where our application would then smooth that into walking. This was before any of your phones could do any of this. In fact, it had to be on this different device that you could wear on your belt. It was about the size of a pager. If you've ever seen one of those, maybe the doctors in the room know what that is. So this was in around 2003 to 2005. When the iPhone came out and the first Android G1 phone came out in 2007, my students, led by Scott Saponis, John Freilich, my colleague James Fogarty, and others, were the first to show how you could do the same activity inference on the iPhone and the Android G1 without all those sensors, just using some of those few sensors that were on phones on that first generation. Later, with more sensors, you could do more. And eventually, those companies saw how important these applications were that they built, whole sensing processors in there to do it in a low-powered way. When we did it originally, you'd probably burn out your battery in about 45 minutes running this stuff. But we knew, again, that we would be able to, over time, get this. So the MSP platform was what drove the activity inference for the UbiFit application, which was a really impactful project led by Sunny, which changed how we think about ambient displays and fitness behavior change. So the display on the wallpaper and the lock screen of the phone animated, adding flowers as you engaged in physical activity, and then eventually showing a butterfly when you met your goal for the week. And again, it took this interdisciplinary team to carry out this project and to design it as well as to evaluate it. And we evaluated that system over several months and showed how it led to behavior change with the folks who are using it. Now, organizationally, the lessons for me at Intel were large. Before I joined, the lab was really in some disarray. The researchers were asking me to find a way out. When I first joined, there were 7 researchers and 20 projects with little traction. and they had a lot of offers out. So it was soon to grow to over 15 researchers and more projects. And so the question for me was how to use a small team to compete with other research labs out there who are working in other areas of ubiquitous computing like Microsoft Research and others. And so the key was achieving critical mass. So focusing on a few key areas and where we could make important contributions. So I cut those 20 projects down to 2, eventually growing it to 3. And we had, again, really balanced, diverse teams, often a person with hardware, machine learning, HCI, working together to push something forward. And we did this with buy-in from the researchers. So often you would think, hey, if you cut a lot of projects like this, everyone would quit. Instead, people were really looking for this to happen, and people stayed. And we succeeded. So in location, we did Place Lab, which led to this beacon-based location that was eventually on all smartphones today, was a way of doing location on your phone without having to lose privacy and send all that data about exactly where you are to the phone company or someone else listening into it. The activity and that actually led to the original location capability in the original iPhone, which did not have a GPS chip in it. They essentially, a company took our open source software and built a system that Apple built on top of. So activity inference was also the other major project, as I mentioned. It's now appeared in fitness applications on every smartphone today. Typically, it's built in, whether it's Apple Health or Google Fit, and even on elder care devices that are out there. We also allowed researchers to pursue their time on small offshoots to kind of lead to what's the next big thing. So we had things on wireless power and other things that have gone on to do quite well. Another important key to the success there at Intel was we were able to have an open innovation model. So IP didn't get in the way of collaboration with researchers at the University of Washington. It balanced Intel's IP needs with the needs of UW, so we could still move really fluidly. And that didn't mean that we didn't patent anything. It just meant that the normal practice for projects was to not patent. Every now and then there could be something that we thought was strategic for Intel, for example, some things in the hardware areas where we might instead figure out how to employ people so that we could do patents at the beginning. But almost everything was in the open model. So this critical mass and open innovation, I think, led to real success in hiring top researchers. We were able to get people who maybe would have got a good academic job, but saw this model as a place where they could thrive, and they could also collaborate with students and faculty at a top 5 or top 6 computer science department next door. So we published only at these top venues like UBComp, Pervasive, and Chi, and really influenced the larger corporations. So I regularly, as the leader of the lab, would travel to other parts where Intel is headquartered here down in San Jose, or Santa Clara, as well as in Oregon, to kind of make sure to sell that research to the different product teams. And that helped start a new health business division that was working on that. Of course, Intel, as many large corporations, never had the patience for that to grow into something, and they sold it off a few years later. Now, as I transitioned back full-time to the University of Washington, I really focused on trying to achieve this critical mass there and find more meaning in my work. So I saw an opportunity to create critical mass in HCI and design at UW by linking researchers across, at that point, 4 key departments: the computer science and engineering department, the information school, the folks in design, and at the time a department called technical communications, which today is called HCDE, as well as with the good researchers at Intel and Microsoft Research who were just across the lake. So how could we bring all these people together? And so this allowed us to offer a large number of courses in these key areas of HCI and design, and also allowed us to build balanced research teams with students and faculty, and often had collaborators from these industry labs. And so my own research has often been collaborative with researchers across areas and departments, especially here at Stanford. But take, for example, at that time at UW, the vocal joystick. This was joint with folks in electrical engineering. In fact, the underlying technology was led by Professor Jeff Bilms, but also myself in computer science and others in the iSchool and medicine. And the vocal joystick allows someone to use the continuous vowel sounds that they can make with their voice to control a continuous input on the screen. And this is in contrast to what's possible with discrete commands that at this point was all you could do for speech recognition. And discrete's good for many things, but if you're doing something that requires continuous, for example, painting or drawing, you need a different way of doing it. And so the vocal joystick was particularly useful in assistive technology situations. So take, for instance, Phil, who is no longer with us, but he was a quadriplegic painter from Berkeley who used paint programs for years and couldn't achieve what he was trying to express through the tools that he had. He used our voice draw application that was developed by PhD student Susumu Harada, who's now at Apple, to get the look and feel that he wanted. So for example, in this Jackson Pollock style of this painting he made, and then Susumu himself, using his voice, was able to create this painting using only his voice. I can't do this with my hands. So, you know, I don't know how Susumu did this, but he did. Besides health, I also focused my research at that time on the environment, because I found, besides health being first, that environment was probably the second of the three most important problems I felt the world was facing. And so on the UbiGreen project, we had a critical mass of, again, diverse researchers. So we had CS PhD student John Freilich, who's now professor at UW, and collaborators from Carnegie Mellon at that time, Jen Mankoff, who was at Carnegie Mellon, who's now at UW, and Tawana Dillahunt, who was a first-year graduate student and was our intern on this project at Intel, and she's now faculty at Michigan. And we used ambient feedback with the goal of reducing consumption. And this UI that you see here, it was for consumption of gasoline and other things. So this is called the Reflect Ambient Display. We deployed this again in an electronic picture frame in the home. This one shows a family's water usage, how water is being used, and it's really activity oriented rather than just giving you an amount of water and not knowing where you're using it. And the hope there is if we deployed that over time, you would change behavior. This leveraged this HydroSense water sensor that was developed by John and Professor Shwetak Patel and Professor James Fogarty, where they were able to, with one or two works better, I think, inexpensive sensors that you might just connect to the hose bib under your sink or in your basement. They could detect the pressure signatures as fixtures in your home are turned on and off throughout the home. And it was really easy to deploy. Now, there was a lot of stories behind creating that, including when Shwetak blew up my pipes at our house, but that's another story. So Shwetak was actually a star faculty candidate on the market around that time. And by the way, Shwetak just became a member of the, he's a MacArthur winner, and he just became a member of the CHI Academy in Hawaii at this time. So we were able to attract him to UW at a place that, you know, wasn't yet the top place in this area, but we had become one of the stronger places in UbiComp and human-computer interaction by tying together this DUB community and the people in the industrial research labs. And it really wasn't always that way. UW was not even in the top 10, in my opinion, in HCI or interactive computing when I started there in 2003. My goal was to bring together the faculty and students to form this community I called DUB, which was a cross-campus alliance. And I spent a lot of time, effort, and in fact, my startup funds on building that into a community. And DUB really took off like a rocket. By the time I left 11 years ago, there were over 35 faculty across 8 departments and over 100 graduate students working in this area. And today, I don't know what the real numbers are, but I suspect it's over 50 faculty and over 150 grad students easily. So within 5 years, DUB and UW was easily number 2 or number 3 in HCI in terms of top papers, top students, and overall mind share in the community. One could easily claim it is now the #1 university in HCI research. And so the lesson for me was that creating this alliance allowed us to have much more impact as a group than we ever could alone. So the whole really is greater than the sum of the parts in this case. And that's a strategy I've continued to follow. Now, as I mentioned, I went to China at the same time as I was at UW. Towards the end of my time there, across the world in China, things were really moving fast. But owing to its long history, the Chinese always have a long view on things. And you must kind of really live there and build relationships to expect substantial interaction and collaboration. So that's one of the reasons we chose to take our sabbatical in China in 2009. I wanted to try to set up alliances between the University of Washington and Microsoft Research Asia and Beijing, as well as some major universities doing there. And I was doing research in my time there with the HCI group at MSRA and helping build that group up from scratch. Now, at the time I had read, I think it was about 2010, that China was beating the US in education. And I found that the real story was not as great as the media reports about some of the positives and negatives of the education system there, as well as the education system in the US. There's positives and negatives and all. And so we wanted to figure out what the big goal. And for me, delivering quality education is really the third major problem that the entire world is facing. Different problems in different places, but that's really another problem from this time that influenced my work since then. So I was taking a first stab at this in my time in China, and we were looking at second language learning, which is like a common problem for any of the expats living in Beijing. They're all trying to learn Mandarin and struggling at it. Some do well. Some in my family did a lot better than me. But how do you learn something like Chinese? It's not a short-term activity. It's an activity that spans a long period of time and it's done wherever you go during the day, not just in class or when you're studying a book. And so I was really interested in these kind of what I call long-lived activity applications that work more throughout your life. I think they're harder and more interesting from a research perspective. So one of the systems that we worked on was called ubilingual. And so the idea was to learn language in whatever context you happen to find yourself in. So in a restaurant, the Bluetooth headset in your ear and the phone in your pocket, the system might whisper, how do you say, can I see a menu? And so you might think of the answer in your head, maybe even whisper it to yourself, and then the system responds with the answer. And then you might say, oh, whoops, I thought of, can I see the check? And then I might self-grade myself by putting my middle finger and thumb together to indicate that I got it wrong. So that was kind of the vision of the system. Now, at this point, we hadn't yet created this ideal wireless armband that you see in that image that we imagined could sense this. But we actually had a prototype that used a sweatband with 3 sets of sensors and communication boards attached. So you can see what the board looked like. And there were 3 of those around the sweatband. And this muscle sensing armband was part of Scott Saponis's dissertation research at the University of Washington. Scott was a PhD student who worked with me at UW, but very closely, in fact, a lot on this hardware with Desni Tan at Microsoft Research. And Desni actually, Scott is now a researcher at Microsoft Research, and Desni very recently became the head of Microsoft Research in Redmond. So what was the lesson here? I did not then, and I still do not believe that we should always see ourselves as in competition with folks in Asia or particularly in China, but instead that we live in one world where we should all get better and succeed together. We all win this way. Many of the problems that we face in this world are shared and will only be solved together. So think about problems like the environment and global warming. Without cooperation, these problems are not going to be solved. And there's many others that are like that. I worked on this through my service activities there. So my time in Asia was mainly spent helping to build a stronger HCI community in China. I helped build up HCI in China by organizing across Beijing distinguished lecture series in HCI, where we brought top researchers from across the world. I co-taught an introductory HCI course at Tsinghua, so I could have a direct impact on the students there so they could see how we were teaching HCI. I did visits and talks. My family and I, we traveled a lot and gave talks in Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and many other cities in China to kind of expose to this way of doing research and the importance of this research area. And then finally, I was the co-chair for UbiComp 2011 in, actually, I think it's 2012, but I'm not sure, in Beijing. And that was a great chance to expose folks in China to this area of research. And if you look at the number of papers from Chinese research labs at the CHI conference today, it's really a whole different story. At that time, you might see 1 or 2 papers, and that was a big deal. And now you'll see quite a bit. And I think you can see some of that impact in creating that community of HCI researchers there. There's others who did a lot of that as well and are far more responsible, but I feel like had a small a small hand in that work. So a year after I came back to UW from China in 2012, a funny thing happened to me. Terry Winograd, who is one of the leading figures in the history of HCI, who was originally an AI person and got tenure here at Stanford in AI, but really turned his back on AI because he thought the field was really going the wrong way and really moved into HCI. He pulled me aside at an event here in the Bay Area at Google, and he asked if I could talk to him about Stanford's issue with HCI. And so they were about to lose two of their young faculty members due to two body problems. So Scott Clemmer, who was, again, my PhD student at Berkeley, and Jeff Hare, who worked with me as an undergrad at Berkeley and during his MS at Berkeley as well. And Terry was about to retire. So I thought what Terry was asking me for was, what's your advice on, like, who should we hire? And instead, he was asking if I was interested. And I have to say, I was sort of flabbergasted. Me, Stanford? I never thought I would want to go to Stanford. I went to undergraduate at Berkeley, Cal. We hate Stanford. The Stanford police once told me never to set foot back on this campus. It's another story. I didn't even own a single red shirt. It's true. And I think my family bought me one once. I have a couple now. So Stanford was a place that never wanted me. I think it was the only school that I had applied to, undergrad, graduate, or for a faculty position, that had never said yes. Every other place I eventually got them to say yes at some point, grad school, undergrad, faculty, whatever. But they had, and then finally they had two of my former students, Scott and Jeff, on the faculty. So I never even thought of Stanford. This wouldn't even be a possibility. You don't hire somebody in the same area as their students usually. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought I could do something interesting there and also return to my native California. And as my family and friends know, and the sun that I was really missing in Seattle. I promised my family this was the last time we would move. And I think also my letter writers were really fed up at this point, because having to write letters all the time for tenure is a lot of work. And, I had gotten tenure, but then I asked to get tenure somewhere else and then tenure somewhere else. And I had to write letters every time. And at Stanford, we used to ask for 15 letters. So 15 people were asking to write a letter. So as soon as I arrived at Stanford, I continued a project I had started the previous year. So we spent another year that I'm not going to talk too much about at Cornell Tech. And at Cornell Tech, I actually worked with a brilliant designer, Luke Vink, who I had met first at Microsoft in China when he was an intern. And we had envisioned this interface where drones in the future could project interfaces onto the physical world. So this was a type of augmented reality. And Luke shot this really excellent vision video that became the basis for several projects that we carried out at Stanford over the next few years. So my postdoc, Jessica Cochard, who's soon to be faculty at TU Wien in Vienna, who I also met in China, joined first at Cornell Tech and then moved with me to Stanford. And we took over 2 years to build a prototype of the vision that was illustrated in Luke's vision video. You can catch it on YouTube if you haven't seen it. Other notable projects include PhD student Jane E, who introduced me's work on cultural influences of gestures that people would naturally use to interact with drones. And Jane will be joining the faculty at Singapore National University next year. So congrats to Jane on that. And then eventually PhD student Parastu Abtahi, who's now faculty at Princeton, who combined drones with virtual reality. So you're in virtual reality, but then there's drones that give you haptic feedback when you touch them. She pitched this to me during her rotation quarter with me, and I said, that's crazy, but we should do it. And it took a while, and she got it to work. But after a few years of working on drones, I literally abandoned the project. First, although it was cool, I had a hard time fitting it into my larger research agenda of education, health, and environment, which I thought were the three most important problems to work on. Second, I knew Jessica wanted to continue that line of work, and I thought it best to just let her kind of own the area as she started out on her faculty career. I didn't want to try to compete with her. And then one lesson here is that it's okay to abandon work that you just feel doesn't fit with the message that you're trying to put out there. Sometimes we kind of have a sunk cost fallacy and we just kind of keep pushing because were known in some place, but I just decided I didn't need to keep doing drones if I couldn't find it to fit into what I was really interested in doing. Now, one of the projects here at Stanford that I put a lot of effort into is what I call hybrid physical digital spaces. And a lot of my students here are working on pieces of this. And again, like back to some of my work on the Designer's Outpost at Berkeley and much of the activity sensing work at Intel, we were really exploring what happens when we have reliable sensing systems that can tell different occupant states of people in a building. And then we can have digital adaptations that help change people's behaviors and improve their wellness. So the digital adaptations we considered include dynamic ambient murals in public spaces and on personal devices. So imagine this wall where the pedals are blowing down the wall in this direction, which might encourage me to walk that way. And that happens to be where the stairs are and the elevators that way. So maybe I take the stairs and save the building energy. Or maybe over there is a new employee who I haven't met yet. And so I might just happen to run into them and introduce myself. So a little bit of behavior shaping there. Privacy, though, is really important for this type of sensing and inference project. And that's been part of our research from the beginning, how to understand the privacy considerations and design for it. And that's been a big effort of many of my students and postdocs now at Stanford. Nava Hahigi and Matt Yorke and Andrea Quadra and others have worked on this. This expansive project's also helped a number of strong postdocs go off and do their own work, including Pablo Paredes and Jean Costa, now at Toyota Research, Liz Murnane, who's now at Dartmouth, and as I mentioned, Andrea, who's now at Olin College. We're exploring how these same types of sensing and digital adaptations can be used in healthcare situations. So take us all the way back to that aging in place scenario. What happens if we have smart spaces that can understand what is going on with an older adult, but also help and train and support the personal health assistants who are care workers who are caring for this rapidly aging population. So that's what we're working on there today. And then another project I've been working on since my time in China is the smart primer. And this is an attempt to improve education for kids who might be unmotivated in the current system or simply don't fit in with how they're being taught. And so the idea here was to embed learning activities in narrative media. And that might include features like outdoor AR and AI to make learning more engaging. So many students have worked on this long-term vision for a future of education, including PhD graduate Sherry Ruan, who's here in the room and is walking on Sunday, who's doing a startup in the education area right now, and current PhD student Alan Chang, who's been leading this the last few years. And Alan actually presented what's shown here, the latest in this project at CHI last month. So there's a lot of things I've learned at Stanford. As was mentioned, I co-founded and I'm now co-leading our large institute on human-centered AI. We're here in their beautiful space. And I think there's a lot of lessons I could mention about building a coalition across HCI and AI, across an entire campus, working with industry to make a positive impact on how AI will be shaped. But here I'm going to focus more on the key lessons from my own research group. I think really the key organizational feature I've been able to develop at Stanford is a real sense of team spirit. I have a group of students that get along with each other. They help each other. They know we are in this together. And it all really started with my first Stanford PhD student, Jane, who really exemplified the spirit of helping others out on their research, even when she wasn't a paper co-author or they weren't a co-author. For example, Jane was known to shoot videos for other people's papers. And this spirit was infectious and really set the tone for many of the students that have now passed through my lab at Stanford over the last 10 years. So thank you for that, Jane. Again, this award was won by me with my PhD students, 22 who have graduated so far, Jackie any day now, MS students, postdocs, current PhD students, and faculty collaborators. I apologize to anyone I've left off, including the many visitors, research staff at Intel and Microsoft, other faculty I've collaborated with on many things, and literally hundreds of undergraduate researchers who have worked with my team over the last 27 years. And I was also fortunate that many of these folks that I've worked with over the years, over 30, were able to make a tough trip to Honolulu and join us. And among that group were undergraduates who worked with me at Berkeley 25 years ago and went on to get their PhDs and stayed in the field. So thanks again to those who are either watching or watching for the second time here in the room for celebrating with me. Finally, I'd like to close by thanking my family for their patience through all the hard work, the late nights and weekends of I need to read this paper and give feedback, or I have a proposal deadline, or I have to travel. They've taken on a much more of the load than I have. And I know that this is an advantage that I have over others who don't have the same type of support. And I appreciate it. And I know that we couldn't have achieved what we have achieved without it. Thank you again for this great honor. And I hope that we have time for just a few questions. Thank you. We have a mic over here. We have a hand up in the back. And we're also going to look at questions on the Slido because I know there's 30 or 40 people maybe online.
Hi, James. That was really cool to learn. I just was curious because you mentioned that the focus area you had were education, health, and environment. Has that changed? What is your current focus?
Yeah, I mean, so I came up with that idea of these are my 3 core areas while I was on that sabbatical in China in 2009 to 11. I would say that's not the only areas I work in, because when somebody asks me, what do you work on? I often say, well, it's what my PhD students are working on. So I sometimes have PhD students who are doing something outside of that because it's interesting, but I'm unlikely to follow some other area for a long time unless it somehow kind of fits into that. So there will often be, even at Berkeley, when I was doing informal interfaces, I also was doing a drawing tool for the blind. It didn't fit into what I was doing, but it was interesting. And I had a student who was passionate, who was blind actually, and was wanting to do that. Similarly here at Stanford, there's some projects that are offshoots, and I may not have mentioned them here because they're kind of off of that. But in general, if I looked at all the things my students are doing and that I'm doing, I would say 90% of them fall into kind of health, education, environment. I would say environment is the one that I've done much less of over the last 10 years and keep trying to bring back because it's actually a really hard one. But we have some work there as well, mainly about how do physical spaces affect your environmental activities. And so that's one area I want to do a little more in. But yeah, thank you for that question. Other questions?
From the Slido.
Oh, okay.
In the meantime, there's an anonymous question. There are some cool ideas you've done, but I think there are also some constraints due to the funding that supports your work. So how do you balance the creative and inspiring work? It moved. Versus maybe more practical research that is funded or more likely funded.
I mean, so as faculty members, we're always like looking for funding. My graduate students know this. We're always like, oh, write another grant proposal, write another, fellowship proposal. So you're always looking to fund things. I don't feel like the work I do, though, has been driven by the funding. I think it's been more driven by what I'm interested in. And then we look for the funding to figure out how to fund it. Now, I will also note that I am in a special position. I have been at wealthy universities that, do well for funding, like at Berkeley, at UW, and at Stanford. I don't think there's anywhere like it here in terms of the funding that we have internally to fund research or the connections with industry that helps fund the research. So my situation is not going to be the same as someone at a state school in another state that's not at that level. And that has allowed me more freedom. So I actually can't reflect too strongly on what it would be like because that's not been my situation. I'd say maybe a little more at UW, it was a little harder, but even then I had this Intel Research Lab, which allowed me to have resources as well. So I've been fortunate to be in places where there was funding, but even then, you're always struggling to kind of get that next NSF grant or get this next thing to fund your work. In fact, I've struggled quite a bit to get those. Yeah.
What do you know now that you wish you had known then? And you can choose.
Did you ask this already? No.
No. And you can choose whether then is PhD time or early professorhood.
I mean, that's a good question. So Andrea asked, what do I know now that I wish I had known then? I mean, this focus on my students, I think has been true from the start. But I think I also had more of a focus on the research as well. And over time, I think the balance between those have changed. I've really decided, nah, the research is just the way we get there. I like doing research, but I think maybe research and what I'm working on would have been more primary earlier on in my career. And as I've gotten to this stage, there was this point, I was always focused on, I want my students to do well and I would do well. But this idea of thinking that actual product is people, not research, was something that I figured out along the way and probably did not know when I first started. And that changes how you think about things that you're doing in, I think, important ways. Another question back here.
You mentioned balance between design and kind of the technical aspects. And I was wondering with like the most pressing challenges or even with the elderly care system that you're talking about that you're bringing back or studying today, do you feel like the challenges are the most important challenges to solve are like design questions or like the technical aspects?
That's a really good question. So in many of these projects, when I first was looking at them, I thought the technical aspects were the really hard part. Like, for example, Smart Primer. I was going to make this educational tutor for kids. You know, that was based on Neil Stephenson's 1995 novel, The Diamond Age, that I read when I was a graduate student. And when we read it, we thought, oh, this is impossible because this will require what we called, well, we said the problem was, quote, AI complete, kind of think like NP complete, like you just couldn't do it. And when the iPad came out in 2010 is when I started rethinking about that. And I thought, oh, machine learning has really actually, we hadn't even gotten the deep learning revolution. But even by then, I thought machine learning, statistical machine learning's come a long way. We actually could do some of these things that I imagined from the novel. And I started to think, wow, the hard part is the design. How do I get somebody who would want to use this, you know, for years versus apps that people make and somebody might just throw it away after a little bit. So design became primary. And again, in this elder care scenario, I think we've had technology that could solve it, maybe not perfectly. And I now know we have technology I think that can solve it. But still, how do you design it in a way that you deal with these issues? Privacy, autonomy, the people who are feeling in charge, making sure that that care worker doesn't feel like they're being replaced. Those are all design questions. And I think they're kind of the harder questions. But you can't solve it without working on both sides of it.
What are the biggest opportunities that you see in climate today?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I guess if I knew, I'd be working on it. I mean, we often get asked, you know, why aren't you funding more research here at HAI and AI and climate? And I just, you know, there's good things there you can do. For example, remote sensing of what's happening in different countries where people might be cheating on certain things that are bad for the environment. But most of the AI research on that is not really research. It's like things we just already know how to do. From an HCI perspective, I've been focused on behavior change, even though I've come to the realization that that's sort of a cop-out because the real solutions for climate are government solutions, policy changes to say, for example, we have a carbon tax. Like that would make a big change versus me trying to influence you to not drive your car as much, okay? Individual change, I think, in some ways is a way of avoiding the harder political changes that need to happen. And you might even say that's true in some other areas where we ask people to kind of change their behavior when what we really need is a systemic structural change to solve it. So climate, if you got good ideas, let me know, because this is an area I would like to do more in. But I'm a little worried that my prior work of just trying to nudge you to do better behavior is not the right solution. So it might be more about how do I change knowledge and change political impact and change how people vote.
Hi, this is Kate. So my question, your career has spanned, you know, quite a few changes, right? In the mobile, people started using mobile phones. Now we're moving into AI. So how have you navigated creating research agendas as these emerging technologies came out? And one, how did you know that this is a technology worth embracing? And two, what did you say to skeptics who were saying, oh, this is a phase, this is not going to go?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, but a standard key trick in kind of systems-oriented computer science, whether it's systems or HCI, is to see what technology trends are happening, because you know it's going to take years, and like put your aim out there so that your research is positioned to have impact. Because if you're too near term, there's just thousands of companies and thousands of engineers who will be working on the same problem, and you won't really be able to compete with that. So, you know, at the time that I came out of graduate school, you know, the web had just, we were doing World Wide Web stuff when I was a grad student, but it wasn't in my research. And in fact, the last tool I wanted to do was, sketch websites. That's what I want to do. And my advisor was like, no, you need to graduate. And so it ended up being, that was my first project as a faculty member. So that was happening. We were looking at how to do it, but we saw mobile computing starting to happen. Now, at that point, it was like, you had to have like a special modem plugged into your laptop that you could then, there was actually you might even see them around here. There was a company, Metrocom, that hung these things on the power lines everywhere, and you could get wireless signals from it, and they eventually went out of business. But a bunch of us had those modems, and we were doing research on this mobile computing that we thought was going to happen. And what do you know? Eventually Wi-Fi and eventually cellular data, you know, but it took 10, 15 years from when we were playing with it. Similarly, the phones, you know, and the phones, actually before there were even phones, we had like PDA. So we had, you know, the Palm Pilot, and I did a bunch of research. I had my whole undergrad class, they had to do all their apps on the Palm Pilot, actually. So we were even pushing the students to be looking to the future. And we were starting to do research where you plugged one of those, you know, you Velcroed one of those wireless modems on the back of a Palm Pilot to start looking at this mobile interface that we thought would be the future. And what do you know? 10 years later again, you know, or 8, you know, we start to get smartphones, and eventually the iPhone that not broke it open. But all of these technologies usually exist 10 years or more before they become ubiquitous. You know, the first smartphone probably is like, there was an IBM phone. It was like this big and that thick, and it had wireless data, and it could do all this stuff. But, you know, they didn't, I don't even remember if it was a product or not, but, you know, they weren't going to sell a lot of these. So often you're looking at these research prototypes and just looking at the trends and figuring out what's going to happen next. And similarly, AI, like my students, again, we've been working on AI forever because we knew eventually it's going to work. It'd been creeping forward, and then we saw, you know, this hockey stick, because we knew eventually that's part of it. So a lot of HCI, multimodal user interfaces, a lot of this work was this vision of when that stuff works, then we have a new vision of how you might interact with it. So often, you know, people have said the technology that's going to be the next big thing has probably already been invented 10 or 15 years ago. It just hasn't become, you know, ubiquitous yet because it's not easy to use, or it's too expensive, or the performance isn't there. But so right now you could go, what's that thing? It's in somebody's research lab. You know, many of us have been working on AR for years. I'm like, oh yeah, someday VR, AR. I've usually been the VR skeptic. AR, I still believe is a thing. You know, it's still kind of bubbling and not a big thing, but I think that one will happen. It's just a question of when it gets down to this size, then I think it takes off, because most of us don't want to walk around with ski glasses on our face all day. We'll take one more question and then we'll wrap up, because I know people have to be places.
I think this is a very good last question then. You took us on a multi-stop career journey across a couple of decades, I dare say. And my question is, what's the next stop for you? What do you want to be the next?
Well, I'm glad my family left, because I shouldn't say I'm moving somewhere else. I mean, I kind of don't want to move anymore. I've moved a lot. It takes a lot of energy actually to restart a research group over and over. I've done it too many times at this point. Usually I've moved when I've gotten kind of a little bored, because like I did a thing and it just, like, okay, now what do you do? So like at UW, this dub thing was just taken off. And I was like, what do I do now? That's working. And here at Stanford, we actually tried to create sort of a dub Stanford thing when I got here. And I quickly realized that wasn't going to happen here. And at the same time, AI was really starting to take off. And I realized, oh, that's where I could really have a leverage to help raise other people's research and raise the impact on the world. And right now, we're doing so much there that it's not boring. As the staff here will know, it's never boring. We're doing lots of exciting things. So until I'm bored, I'm not really going anywhere. So my students know, keep me from getting bored, and they don't have to worry about transitions of James. So anyways, thank you. I appreciate you coming out and being on it.